The water level in Lake Mead is falling right now. Today, not because of a heat wave, not because of a lack of rain. It is falling because 350 miles upstream, a team of federal engineers is deliberately choking off its water supply. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is not an exaggeration. That is the documented operational reality as of July 11th, 2026, Lake Mead. The largest reservoir in the United States, lifeline for 25 million people, is being systematically drained by the very agency tasked with managing it. Its surface sits at 1,042.89 feet, an elevation that is already crippling power generation at Hoover Dam. And here is the part that should stop you cold. New projections released just last month show that by this time next year, Lake Mead could crash to 1,020 feet, a level so low it was once considered unthinkable. A level that would force the majority of Hoover Dam's mighty turbines into silence. And it's all happening because of an engineering flaw, a catastrophic vulnerability hidden in plain sight for 60 years at the dam upstream. A flaw so dangerous that to protect one dam, the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation is willing to sacrifice another, 2 reservoirs, engineered to work in tandem. Now, one is being used as a shield, while the other is being pushed off a cliff. This is not a story about drought. This is a story about physics. And it's a story about a chain reaction that has already begun. To understand why Lake Mead is being starved, you have to understand the number 3,490. That number, 3,490 feet, is a line in the water at Lake Powell. It is the elevation of the dam's minimum power pool. It is not an arbitrary guideline. It is a hard physical limit. Below this point, the water level is too low to enter the main hydroelectric penstocks. The massive turbines inside Glen Canyon Dam fall silent. The power generation, enough for millions of homes, stops, gone for 60 years. This was a theoretical problem. A number in an operator's manual that no one ever expected to see. But as of this morning, Lake Powell sits at 3,524.45 feet. That is just 34.45 feet of buffer. 34 feet between normal operation and a complete power blackout at the second biggest dam on the river. But losing power is not even the engineers' biggest fear. What they fear is what comes next. Because below 3,490 feet, there is only one way to get water out of Lake Powell. 4 steel pipes, each just 96 inches wide, bolted to the base of the dam. They are called the River Outlet Works. They are not a primary system. They are not a backup powerhouse. They were designed as a temporary bypass, an emergency last resort, and now they are the only thing standing between the lower Colorado River and oblivion, a set of pipes that were never, ever meant to be the sole lifeline for 40 million people. And here is the problem. Those pipes can't handle it. Running them at the required volume, at these historically low lake levels, unleashes a force that can tear solid steel and concrete apart from the inside out. A force called cavitation. Cavitation is not erosion. It is not friction. It is a violent hydraulic phenomenon that engineers have feared since the first dams were built. It starts with a tiny vapor bubble formed in a low-pressure area of fast-moving water. That bubble travels for a microsecond. Then, as the pressure changes, it collapses. It implodes. That implosion generates a shock wave, and for an instant, at a microscopic point, the temperature is hotter than the surface of the sun. Thousands of these events happening every second are like a continuous series of tiny, microscopic dynamite charges detonating against the inside of the pipes, blasting away molecules of solid steel, pitting and tearing at the reinforced concrete foundations of the dam itself. An internal memo from the Bureau of Reclamation's own Technical Service Center from March 2024 confirmed it. The River Outlet Works have already sustained cavitation damage. They are already compromised. This is the fear that is driving every decision on the Colorado River right now. This is why Katrina Grants, a deputy regional director for the Bureau of Reclamation, said in June that Glen Canyon Dam must be operated within strict structural limitations. That is not bureaucratic doublespeak. That is a carefully worded admission of terror. It means they know the bypass tubes are vulnerable. It means they cannot run them at the rate needed to satisfy the water rights of everyone downstream. It means that to prevent Glen Canyon Dam from vibrating itself to pieces, they have to hold water back. So they do. In April 2026, the USPR announced it was slashing releases from Lake Powell by 1.48 million acre-feet. That is not water that disappeared to evaporation. That is water that was deliberately held back. Water that was legally owed to Lake Mead and the lower basin states. Every gallon held in Lake Powell to keep the water level above the cavitation danger zone is a gallon that disappears from Lake Mead. It is a zero-sum game. Saving Lake Powell's plumbing means draining Lake Mead. They are not guessing that cavitation is dangerous. They know. Because they have seen it before. And it almost cost them everything. June 1983, a massive El Niño weather pattern had just drenched the Rocky Mountains. The snowpack was historic. And when it melted, it all came rushing down the Colorado River. It came in a torrent, the likes of which no one had seen since the dam was built. By late June, the water was rising so fast at Lake Powell that engineers were panicking. They were staring at the unthinkable, the possibility that water could go over the top of the 710-foot-tall dam, a situation that could erode the dam's foundations and lead to a total structural failure. They needed to release water. Fast, more water than the main turbines could handle. So they turned to the dam's emergency spillways, 2 massive tunnels, 41 feet in diameter, bored through the solid rock on either side of the dam, designed for exactly this kind of emergency. A fail-safe. On paper. They opened the gates. The water roared into the tunnels, and almost immediately something went wrong. The whole dam began to vibrate. A low, violent shudder that rattled the control room. Workers below ground reported hearing what sounded like rocks and debris being thrown against the tunnel walls. The noise was terrifying. The vibration was getting worse. Fearing the dam itself was at risk of shaking apart, they cut the flow. When they were finally able to send a remote camera down into the tunnels, what they saw was a scene of utter destruction. The cavitation, the same force they fear today in the bypass tubes, had ripped out massive chunks of reinforced concrete. In one of the tunnels, it had punched through the 3-foot-thick concrete lining and carved a crater 32 feet deep and 150 feet long into the underlying sandstone. The engineers had almost lost Glen Canyon Dam. The force of the water had almost torn its own release valves to pieces. The powerful Floyd Dominy, the legendary Reclamation Commissioner who bullied this dam into existence, was there. He witnessed the near catastrophe. The memory of 1983 is seared into the institutional memory of the Bureau of Reclamation. They saw with their own eyes what cavitation can do. And the spillways that were almost destroyed in 1983 were massive, fortified tunnels. The river outlet works they are forced to rely on now are, by comparison, fragile straws. This is the ghost that haunts the river. The reason the Bureau is so protective of Lake Powell. They are not just managing water. They are managing the memory of a near-death experience. And their decision, the only decision they feel they can make, is to keep the pressure on the bypass tubes as low as possible, which means keeping the water level in Lake Powell as high as possible, even if it means watching Lake Mead wither and die. The chain reaction started here. It was a choice forced by physics. But the reason they face that choice at all is not because of physics. It's because of a math error made 104 years ago. November 24th, 1922, the delegates from 7 western states gather at a palace in Santa Fe, New Mexico, to do something never before attempted. Divide the water of an entire river basin. They sign the Colorado River Compact. It is the foundational document, the Magna Carta of the American West, the law of the river, and it is based on a lie. The negotiators had about 2 decades of river flow data to work with. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that those 2 decades were among the wettest in the last 500 years. They looked at an abnormally high flow and called it average. Based on that Goldilocks-era data, they allocated 15 million acre-feet of water between the upper and lower basins. They wrote promises for water that the river, in an average year, simply does not have. The river provides about 20% less water than what is guaranteed on paper. It was a math mistake with a fuse a century long. For decades, it didn't matter. The huge reservoirs, Powell and Mead, acted as buffers. They stored the surplus from wet years and paid it out during dry ones. But the West was growing. Cities were exploding. And then came the megadrought. 20-plus years of conditions drier than almost any period in the last 1,200 years. The buffers are gone, the savings account is empty, and all we are left with is the original, flawed math. There was a man who warned them, John Wesley Powell, one armed Civil War veteran, geologist, explorer, in 1869. He led a small expedition in wooden boats down the treacherous, uncharted canyons of the Colorado River. He saw the place for what it was. Arid, unforgiving, he went back to Washington and told Congress that building a civilization in the West based on the water assumptions of the East would be an act of folly. He proposed organizing settlements around watersheds, not arbitrary state lines. He told them the West was a land of scarcity. They listened politely. They ignored his advice. And, in the ultimate act of irony, they named the dam and the reservoir that embodied the exact opposite of his vision after him. Contrast Powell's stark realism with the supreme confidence of Floyd Dominy, the Reclamation Commissioner who built Glen Canyon Dam in the 1960s. Dominy believed in man's dominion over nature. He saw the wild Colorado as a resource being wasted, and he saw it as his mission to tame it. His dam, his lake, were monuments to an era of unshakable faith in engineering, an era that assumed the rain would always fall, that the snow would always melt, that the math from 1922 was correct. Now, Dominy's monument is the epicenter of the crisis. Its core design, the Achilles heel that is bringing the whole system to its knees. The consequences of this 100-year-old mistake are no longer theoretical. They have arrived. Because of the flawed compact and the relentless drought, Lake Powell is hovering just above its failure point. To prevent a 1983-style catastrophe in the bypass tubes, the Bureau, now under the leadership of Commissioner Camille Kalimlam-Taton, is throttling the river. The water that should be flowing to Lake Mead stays trapped behind Glen Canyon Dam. And Lake Mead pays the price. A dropping reservoir is not just a problem for boaters. It is a problem for the entire power grid of the American Southwest. When Lake Mead falls below 1,035 feet, a threshold it will soon cross, up to 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 massive hydropower turbines could be forced offline. Not because the lake is empty, but because there isn't enough vertical pressure, enough head, to run them safely and efficiently. The Western Area Power Administration, the federal agency that sells this power, is already planning for shortages. The lights will not simply go out, but the cheap, clean hydropower that has fueled the growth of cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas will become less reliable and more expensive. And the pain does not stop at the power lines. It radiates out into the American economy in ways most people never see. Take Pinal County, Arizona, a stretch of dusty desert between Phoenix and Tucson. It's also one of the country's most productive agricultural areas, thanks to water pumped from the Colorado River. It's a massive producer of alfalfa. Why does that matter? Because that alfalfa is the primary feed for cattle. When mandatory water cuts hit Arizona, farmers in Pinal County are first on the list. They have no water. They can't grow feed. They sell off their cattle. Ranchers across the West who depend on that feed have to downsize their own herds. 2 years later, that decision, made in a dusty field in Arizona, shows up as a higher price on a gallon of milk or a pound of beef at your grocery store. A plumbing issue at a dam in northern Arizona directly impacts family budgets in Ohio. It's all connected. This is the reality John Ensminger deals with every day. As general manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, his job is to keep the taps flowing for the 2 million residents of Las Vegas. 90% of his city's water comes from Lake Mead. He is one of the chief negotiators for the lower basin, and he has been warning for years that the current path is unsustainable. He sees the numbers from the Bureau of Reclamation, he sees the projections, and he knows the system is flashing red. So what does Las Vegas do? It prepares for the worst. The city spent nearly $1.5 billion to drill what they call the third straw, a massive tunnel drilled through miles of solid rock to near the very bottom of Lake Mead. It's an engineering marvel designed to pull water from the lake even after the surface drops below the old intakes, even below dead pool. It's an act of radical self-preservation. A lifeboat. But here is what the third straw is not. It is not a solution. It is a symptom. It is a recognition by the city of Las Vegas that the system has failed, and that their only option is to secure their own supply, even if it means being the last man standing as the rest of the ship goes down. Because the third straw can pull water for Vegas long after California and Arizona have been completely cut off. It saves one city by writing off its neighbors. This is the endgame the 1922 Compact has led us to. There is one final deadline that makes this entire crisis unavoidable. December 31st, 2026. On that day, the 2007 Interim Guidelines. The complex set of rules that have managed the Reservoir Balancing Act for the last 2 decades expire. They simply cease to exist. After that, there is no plan, no agreed upon system for sharing the pain. On January 16, 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation published its draft plan for what comes next, a document known as the Post-2026 Draft Environmental Impact Statement. The comment period is closed. The negotiators from the 7 basin states are locked in rooms right now, staring at the same grim numbers, the same terrifying projections, and trying to build a new law of the river before the old one evaporates. It is a fundamental reset, a forced admission that the old way of doing business is over. The era of assuming the reservoirs would always be full is over. The era of believing that engineering could conquer any natural limit is over. Now, they are negotiating over scarcity. They are not deciding who gets more water. They are deciding who gets cut less. And the central, unmovable fact on the table is the physical limitation of Glen Canyon Dam. The dam itself is now the bottleneck. The kill switch. Any new plan has to account for the fact that you cannot physically get the water out of Lake Powell if you let it drop too low. And that means Lake Mead's decline is not a bug in the system. It is now a feature. Here is the central paradox. The very dam that Floyd Dominy built to control the Colorado River, the concrete monolith designed to guarantee water delivery to the lower basin for all time, is now the choke point preventing that delivery. The structure designed to solve the problem has become the problem itself. 2 dams, Hoover and Glen Canyon. 2 reservoirs, Mead and Powell, 1 river connecting them, and 1 catastrophic flaw in the plumbing. 100 years ago, a group of men made promises for water that didn't exist. Today, a group of engineers are forced to protect a piece of concrete, and in doing so, they make those long-ago promises impossible to keep. The numbers are not stabilizing. The projections from June 2026 confirm it. They are moving in one direction, and that direction is down. Lake Powell sits just 34 feet from its failure point. Lake Mead is sinking towards a new historic low. The chain reaction is no longer a future threat. It is the measured, documented reality of a system coming apart in real time. The only question left is the one that no one has an answer for. What happens when protecting the concrete of one dam guarantees the collapse